And welcome, everyone. It's really a delight for me to be able to host this fireside chat with my friend and former colleague, Peter Martin. Peter is the author of a terrific new book entitled China's Civilian Army, The Making of Wolf Warrior Diplomacy. So first, let me say a few words about Peter. He's Bloomberg's defense policy and intelligence reporter in Washington, D.C., although at the moment I understand he's in Melbourne, Australia. He was previously based in Beijing, where he wrote extensively on escalating tensions in the US-China relationship and reported from China's border with North Korea and its far western region of Xinjiang. His writing has been published by outlets including Foreign Affairs, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, The National Interest, and The Guardian. He holds degrees from the University of Oxford, Peking University, and the London School of Economics. Pete, it's really a pleasure to reconnect with you and to have a chance to discuss your book. I know you've done a number of appearances. I mentioned to you privately that I heard part of your session last week with the London School of Economics. So thank you very much for speaking with us today.
My pleasure.
There's so much to talk about here. It's really been a challenge for me to narrow it down to fit into a 1-hour program. But maybe we can begin by asking you to explain very briefly the term wolf warrior in case there's anyone out there who isn't familiar with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's this term that comes from this 2017 blockbuster movie called Wolf Warrior 2, which is kind of this Chinese answer to Rambo, I guess. Not really my kind of movie, but it took the Chinese box office by storm when it came out. And it was about these kind of Chinese action heroes fighting foreign bad guys on the continent of Africa. And it just kind of exploded commercially in China. And I think, you know, its commercial success kind of came from this fact that it captured something about the popular mood in 2017, the sense among the Chinese public that China's time had come and it could stand up for itself. It didn't need to be patronized by Americans or other Westerners anymore. And you know, so there was this kind of popular sentiment. Then at the same time, Chinese diplomats started acting in this kind of aggressive, assertive way, and the foreign media started to dub their behavior wolf warrior diplomacy, and the term kind of stuck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, you have some great anecdotes about wolf warrior diplomats, and we'll come to that in a second. A quick note to our audience before we get into this. I think everyone is familiar with these Zoom meetings, but if you have questions, you can put them in anytime using the Q&A box, and then we'll get to them in about 30 minutes or so. So Pete, let's start with a look at where we are today before we look back at how we got here. We have a much more assertive China under the leadership of Xi Jinping and the emergence of aggressive wolf warrior diplomats, as you just talked about. These two phenomena obviously are connected. Can you say a few words about that and maybe touch on the anecdote from Fiji that from a little over a year ago that you described towards the end of your book, and perhaps a word or two on Zhao Lijian, who is perhaps the most visible manifestation of this new muscular diplomacy?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the phenomenon kind of took the world by storm around that 2017, 2018 period. Actually, for those who'd been watching China closely, there had been this kind of slow, steady, and then very rapid build-up of Chinese assertiveness, really since the end of the global financial crisis, as leaders in China started to feel like they should take on a more prominent global role, and that maybe US influence was waning, and that perhaps the US system that the world had been kind of trying to emulate for a long time wasn't all that it had previously been cracked up to be. And Xi Jinping really kind of took the resulting push toward assertiveness in Chinese diplomacy and sent it into overdrive. So he started talking about how China was moving closer and closer to the center of the world stage, how it would never accept bullying by foreign countries, how it was standing tall in the East, and this kind of set up a climate where Chinese envoys, Chinese diplomats felt like they needed to act in a kind of similarly assertive way. There was also a bunch of stuff going on in China's political system that kind of matched that new confidence, with some real insecurities. She was punished. He punished 1.5 million officials in a sweeping anti-corruption campaign. He purged rivals, started experimenting with re-education camps in Western China, cracked down on Western ideology. And so there was kind of this jumpy insecurity that went alongside that. And the combination of those two, I think, resulted in Wolf Warrior diplomacy, where we had Chinese envoys storming out of international meetings, telling foreign counterparts to shut up. In the case of Zhao Lijin, the official you mentioned, who actually was previously a pretty kind of low-key official in the Chinese embassy in Islamabad, he picked a Twitter fight with former US National Security Advisor Susan Rice, which kind of rocketed him to fame in China and resulted in him being appointed foreign ministry spokesman. And in that position, he spread a conspiracy theory which suggested that the US Army had started the global COVID-19 pandemic in Wuhan. So, pretty shocking stuff. And as you mentioned, in late 2020, there was even a literal fistfight between Chinese and Taiwanese diplomats in Fiji over the kind of bizarrely trivial matter of a cake which Chinese foreign ministry officials felt had been inappropriately decorated, and the resulting scuffle resulted in one Taiwanese official ending up with a concussion and being treated in hospital. So a pretty alarming array of behavior and not particularly diplomatic.
I wonder if that sort of thing happens in Fiji all the time, and I wonder if Taiwan is going to start trying to recruit tougher diplomats on their side to be able to acquit themselves better. Anyway, I love that story. So let's back up a bit now. Your book does a great job connecting China's modern foreign policy and the diplomats who are implementing that policy to the history of the Chinese Communist Party itself. And along the way, it provides a wonderfully succinct modern history of China, I have to say. You trace the origins of China's modern diplomacy to the need for international support and recognition following the Communist near decimation in 1934-35, the Long March and so forth. So perhaps I can ask you to say a few words about those early years in Yan'an, the work of Zhou Enlai, and the utilization of Edgar Snow, who wrote the very influential Red Star over China, which was really the first introduction for many of us to Mao and the Chinese communists.
Yeah, I mean, so in a sense, the Chinese Communist Party has been practicing some kind of diplomacy since long before it came to power in 1949. With its success in the Chinese Revolution, and it really stemmed from the fact that the communists, with this kind of armed underground movement, which was for much of their existence kind of being chased around China very much on the back foot, and to survive needed to start reaching out to the outside world, Stalin's Russia, but also Great Britain, the United States, and other powers, in order to try to build up some kind of legitimacy. So Zhou Enlai kind of had this small group of quasi diplomats that worked with him in those early years in the 1930s and the 1940s, and they weren't really conducting state to state diplomacy, but they were kind of conducting party to state diplomacy, I guess. And even in those early years, there was this kind of quite fraught relationship between this need to reach out to the outside world and build friends and win influence for the Communist Party, and also this acute fear that existed of foreign influence and the potential for capitalist enemies of communism to undermine the revolution, or to spy on the Communist Party, or threaten its ability to survive. And of course this kind of emerging doctrine of Maoism, which was kind of coming together in these years of relative exile for the Communist Party, and it was always difficult for diplomats to kind of figure out what place they would play there, as Mao focused on kind of peasant values and simple living. They needed to learn to wine and dine foreign dignitaries. And one of the ways they did that was with this focus on winning friends for China, which was kind of a technique which they emulated from the Soviet Union a little bit, where they would, if they couldn't win over the governments of foreign countries, they would identify particular groups or individuals who might be amenable to close ties with the communists. And one such individual was this American journalist called Edgar Snow, who received this incredible VIP treatment and wrote a kind of glowing profile of Mao, which turned into a book in which he described Mao as a Lincoln-esque leader who was, kind of helping China march toward the road of freedom. And it's amazing, really, that you can see, the seeds of that approach were visible then in the 30s and 40s. And in many ways, that same playbook is still used for foreign dignitaries and for online influencers, for example, who China wants to get to say nice things about its policies in Xinjiang. And there really is remarkable continuity there.
And Edgar Snow was maybe, I don't know if he was the first, but he certainly was the most prominent so-called friend of China. That maybe say a few words about that. I mean, this is something that all those of us who have dealt with China over the years are very familiar with, being a so-called friend of China, what that means and so forth.
Yeah, it's a term which I think most people who focus on China closely sort of makes them feel a little bit uncomfortable to go near that title. But many prominent people, including George H.W. Bush, in his memoirs, talked about it as a kind of badge of honor, as a sign that China appreciated his efforts to improve the relationship, and on some level that's true. But I think that this idea of friendship also has a very, very specific meaning inside the Chinese political system. And the best description I've heard was that it's someone who's really willing to give the Chinese Communist Party the benefit of the doubt in return for access that they wouldn't otherwise receive. Not necessarily people who are working as propagandists, but people who try very hard to see the world from Beijing's perspective, relay that to outsiders, and might along the way lose sight of some of the kind of more critical perspectives that others might hold. And these people will be taken on tours of Tibet and Xinjiang and places which would otherwise not be available to them. They might get meetings with Xi Jinping or other top Chinese officials, and part of the price of doing that is kind of staying on Beijing's right side. And so when you hear this phrase, old friend of the Chinese people, that's kind of what they're getting at.
Yeah, I've been actually on both sides of that, as I've been in and out of China for 40 years now. And many of those times, and many of the times that I was living in China, I was treated as a friend of China, which means you get wonderful treatment. You get hosted to banquets, you get treated like, a VVIP. But if you get on the wrong side of them, all of that gets turned off, and it couldn't be any colder, the kind of treatment that you get. And speaking of Edgar Snow, didn't they bring him back more recently to try to use him again?
Yeah, he came back in the 1950s, and his accounts are. It's kind of sad to read the accounts that he wrote in those decades, because in the 30s, I think he was a little bit naive, but he picked up on a genuine mood of enthusiasm and hope for what China might become under new leadership. And of course, an international environment where people didn't look on communism in quite the way that we look on it now. But in the 50s, China was by the late 50s, China was in the middle of a massive man-made famine, where tens of millions of people were starving, and Snow was kind of taken on this highly curated tour of China, and he wrote to Western audiences afterwards, I've I tried my best to look for signs of famine, but I found none, and that really makes pretty uncomfortable reading, given what we know now. And he was actually used a final time as well, as the Nixon administration and an aging chairman Mao sort of sent furtive signals toward each other. Mao tried to use an appearance by Snow in Beijing as a signal to Nixon that he was open to improving ties, but actually the CIA kind of noticed that signal at the time, but wrote it off because they thought that Snow was a communist propagandist and shouldn't take him seriously, which draw your own conclusions, but yeah.
Very, very interesting. And when you're talking about the late 50s, that's, of course, the great leap forward. I mean, you put it very diplomatically, man-made famine. I mean, those were disastrous policies that Mao enacted that, as you said, led to the starvation death of tens of millions of people. So for Snow to be kind of propagandizing about that is quite something. So just to final, going back to the 30s, can you talk for a minute about Zhou Enlai and his role in sort of developing the first sort of would-be Chinese diplomats?
Yeah, I mean, so I really think of Zhou Enlai as very much the kind of founding father of Chinese diplomacy. His influence, his personality, his political style kind of permeates every aspect of the way that the foreign ministry worked and continues to work. And the best kind of analogy I can think of is J. Edgar Hoover with the FBI, someone whose personality really shaped an institution. And I talked before about this very tricky tension that Chinese diplomats have always faced between being open toward the outside world and winning friends, and then dealing with this kind of secrecy and paranoia, which is inherent to the way that the Chinese Communist Party functions. And so Zhou's way of dealing with that was that he said that Chinese diplomats should think and act like the People's Liberation Army in civilian clothing. And so that was kind of, useful on a practical level, in fact, for many of China's early diplomats, many of whom had never been overseas, didn't speak foreign languages, and really had no clue how to enter into this rarefied world of international diplomacy. So he was basically saying to them, look, you don't know how to be diplomats, but you know how to fight in a revolution. So just do that. But this time, words are your tools rather than guns. And, modeling Chinese diplomacy on the People's Liberation Army had this additional advantage that it required absolute discipline and loyalty to the Communist Party, and an ability to follow instructions at all times, never to deviate from official messaging. And it came with this whole kind of body of rules and practices which were aimed to uphold that, the most striking of which is the buddy system that they use, where Chinese diplomats move around in pairs to kind of keep tabs on each other. And so I really think it was kind of Zhou Enlai who put that system together, and it's incredible really how much of it still remains today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just picking up on that theme of those early practices carrying forward all the way to the present time. You wrote that in the early 40s, 1942, 43, there was a rectification campaign, the first purge of the sort of the diplomatic corps that Mao launched. Maybe just talk about that briefly and how that has also carried forward beyond the 40s.
Yeah, I mean, so this is something that Chinese diplomats have had to deal with, as you say, since even before the founding of the PRC, this knowledge that these periodic crackdowns in China's political system come, and that oftentimes kind of the targets of accusations are those who have foreign ties or might be, linked to foreign ideologies or have spent time with capitalists or whatever in some way. And so that was the case in the rectification campaign in the 40s, which affected everyone from across the bureaucracy, not just diplomats, but it included junior kind of would-be diplomats and went all the way up to Zhou Enlai. And it had this kind of stultifying effect where people became suddenly incredibly cautious about any kind of outside contact, extremely careful with the words that they used. And I think there was this real kind of loss of innocence for the kind of Chinese Revolution in the making at that time. This realization that that you could get in real trouble if you behaved in the wrong way. And that was a very important moment in Mao's ability to exert control over the Communist Party. But I think it was also a kind of important formative moment in the way that Chinese diplomacy would later come together, and it was repeated or kind of rhymed with subsequent experiences in the 50s with the anti-rightist campaign, with the 1960s during the Cultural Revolution, when diplomats again became suspects just for really having done their jobs and meeting foreigners and having interactions and outside conversations. And in many ways, I think it also has echoes in today's China with Xi Jinping and the kind of political crackdown that he's led.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really interesting. So let's skip forward a little bit more. So following the end of World War II and the Civil War with the KMT, the PRC, People's Republic, was established on October 1st, 1949. You have an interesting anecdote in your book about the first foreign ambassador to China from Romania presenting his credentials to Mao, and if I remember the number correctly, 10 former generals who themselves were about to become ambassadors, kind of peeking in from behind the curtains to watch the scene. Maybe you could talk a bit about that and about these early diplomats, the new civilian army.
Yeah, so China's first overseas ambassadors were picked mainly from the ranks of generals in the PLA, and so. As I said, they had been overseas. Most of them didn't speak English. Many of them didn't want diplomatic postings. They wanted to continue their military careers. But they kind of took up these roles and had to learn everything about diplomacy. So they were given lessons on how to eat with a knife and fork, how they should stand at dinner parties, how to do up a necktie, and really this like very, very basic stuff, which they'd never had any need for as kind of communist guerrilla fighters. But they were now confronted with. And so Mao and Zhou Enlai kind of saw this potential learning moment for them as Romania's communist Romania's ambassador to China, kind of presented his credentials to Mao, which is this kind of arcane ceremony which has its roots in European diplomacy, and Chinese diplomats would need to repeat as they went out around the world. And so this group of 10 kind of hardened revolutionary fighters kind of gathered surreptitiously as the Romanian ambassador handed over his credentials. They kind of peeked through this hole in a door and had really like no idea what was going on. I remember there was an exchange where one of them said to another, what is this gibberish they're talking about, and this kind of high diplomatic language, and how do we repeat it? And the other one, another one kind of responded, it doesn't matter, we're talking through a translator anyway, just give the translator the right text and say whatever you want. So they were kind of really learning as they went along in those early days. And, they've come a long way from there, but it's still instructive, I think, to kind of look back at those moments.
I mean, that's a great image. Speaking about our arcane ceremony, I served a couple of tours in the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, and the American ambassador to Japan actually rides when he or she arrives. They ride in a horse-drawn carriage to the palace and present their credentials to the emperor. So it's quite something, actually. I wonder what those early Chinese diplomats would have thought of that. So to me, I find that the history that you've laid out here to be endlessly fascinating. But in the interest of time, let's jump ahead a bit
Sure.
and touch on a couple of other historical topics before we get to the present. And let me remind our audience again, please feel free to put in your questions anytime, and we'll get to those soon. So first, the first thing I'd like you to talk about is the 1955 bombing of the plane that was to take Zhou Enlai to Bandung, Indonesia, how Zhou escaped death, and the significance of that conference and Zhou's speech that he gave there. So why don't we start with that, and then we'll move up to the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah, so this was this conference called in 55, Bandung, Indonesia, for Asian and African nations which didn't identify as either part of the Soviet bloc in the Cold War or the capitalist West, and wanted to kind of forge their own path in international affairs. And at the time, most of Beijing's outside friends and countries that even recognized the Communist Party's right to rule China were part of the Soviet bloc. And so it was this really quite unique opportunity where China was really kind of taken under the wing of Nehru, India's then prime minister, and had this chance to kind of win friends across the world and build out its influence in that way. And I guess that the US at the time saw this as kind of a threat, the ability of the Chinese to spread their wings a little bit, and the communist rival nationalist government on the island of Taiwan also saw it as kind of a threat in the sense that it represented such a great opportunity for the communists. And so their intelligence services actually put together a plot to bomb the plane that Zhou Enlai would take to the Bandung conference, but Chinese intelligence intercepted that plot ahead of time, and Zhou was able to make it there. Although a group of Chinese diplomats and journalists actually did board the original plane, and which was blown up somewhere over the Pacific in kind of a mark of how, although Zhou Enlai has this kind of cuddly image, he could be pretty ruthless at times too. Anyway, Zhou arrived at the conference and really delivered one of the most impressive displays of in the history of PRC diplomacy, and he was able to judge that the CCP's kind of go-to talking points about Taiwan and about communism and Maoism weren't going to go down particularly well, and so he set aside his prepared remarks and delivered this speech which really spoke to the interests of the people in the room. And he kind of used this approach where he centered in on the not quite the self-determination of nations, but the ability of nations to rule themselves through state sovereignty, which was very important to the PRC, but also resonated a lot among these newly independent post-colonial nations. And he helped to kind of use that moment to launch China into a much wider array of international relationships. And I really see that as, there have been these kind of two approaches in Chinese diplomacy which have cycled in and out over time. There's been this ability to charm the world when Chinese leaders have decided that that's their priority, and there's also been these kind of wolf warrior type moments we talked about earlier. And this Bandung meeting was really the high point of the first charm offensive which China launched toward the outside world.
Yeah, and when I was studying Chinese history many years later, that Bandung conference was featured quite prominently in our studies, and those principles that he laid out are still used by China today.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Interesting, and the story about the bombing of the plane is really quite remarkable. That would be a great story, plot for a movie. I think my wife is listening. Right. I don't know if she's gonna make a movie about this, but. So let's continue to move forward. So from starting 1966 until 76, of course, we had the Cultural Revolution in China, which had a huge impact on everything, but also on China's foreign policy and its practitioners, most specifically for our purposes today. And then in the middle of that, we have Nixon's visit and China's opening to America. So maybe you can talk a bit about those two topics.
Yeah, I mean, it was this remarkable kind of turnaround because Mao initiated the Cultural Revolution, which he really saw as a bid to undo the malign influence of the stultifying influence of bureaucracy, and to kind of continue to give the Chinese Revolution some dynamism by shaking up the hierarchy inside China. And the result of that was, chaos across Chinese society, but also, real chaos for China's diplomatic system, where, the hierarchies were shaken up inside Chinese embassies. And you had these situations where junior diplomats were turning on their superiors. They forced them to clean toilets. They beat them up. They accused them of being capitalist roaders. And, that happened at junior levels, but it really, the persecution spread all the way up to then Foreign Minister Chen Yi. And it really threw Chinese diplomacy into this kind of disastrous period where China ended up in a state of almost complete isolation, and in fact, at one point only had one ambassador overseas, Huang Hua, who had been posted to the Chinese embassy in Cairo. But kind of from the ashes of that moment, there was this remarkable story of kind of bridge building between China and the US. China and the Soviet Union had been very, very close in the immediate aftermath of the Chinese Revolution, but these tensions had built up over time. And I guess that the US was maybe a little bit slow to act on that because it still viewed China as part of the communist bloc. But eventually, under the Nixon administration and with the help of Henry Kissinger and a bunch of secret diplomacy, the two sides, China and the US, were able to kind of make this diplomatic breakthrough happen. And it really changed the balance of power during the Cold War and sent global history on quite a different trajectory. But it was a very, very unexpected outcome, I think, for most people watching at the time.
And it's quite incredible looking back now, given what we know about what was going on in China at the time, which of course people didn't really know much about when Kissinger went, when Nixon went, but given what we know now, that they were able to do this in the middle of the Cultural Revolution when things were basically turned upside down inside China.
Yeah, and I think it probably would have only been possible for a government as vehemently anti-communist as Richard Nixon's to have pulled off something like this. I think for a more left or center-left government, it would have been pretty tough.
Yeah, that's probably true. And you talk also in the book about subsequently, I mean, given everything that was going on with the junior people attacking their elders at these embassies and beating them up and so forth, and then later having to work together again. And right. Maybe you can say a few words about that. That's incredible to me that happened as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was more or less kind of smoothed over, Zhou Enlai, but at one point during the Cultural Revolution in the early 70s, Mao decided that things had kind of gotten out of hand and there needed to be some semblance of order restored. And so diplomats were sent back overseas with the very same, subordinates who had previously ratted on them and beaten them up and shouted at them, and they had to work together. And there really was no moment of reckoning there. They just had to suck it up and work things out as best they could. And I guess they did so pretty successfully, but it left some pretty deep scars for multiple generations inside the foreign ministry. And really, we're only just seeing the end of generations of Chinese diplomats who were shaped by that experience. Yang Jiechi, who is now China's top diplomat and a Politburo member, was sent overseas to study in the early 70s as this was still all going on in China. And, his study abroad program was very much linked to Zhou Enlai's efforts to rebuild the foreign ministry and develop some English language experts and some America's hands. So yeah, in many ways, these memories are still fresh despite, half a century of history between now and then.
Yeah. And of course, it's not just foreign service. I mean, that was true in all kinds of work environments, universities, and so on. People who had been at each other's throats. Basically, had to put it all behind them, or at least keep quiet about it and work together. I saw a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times, there was an interesting piece about alleged political interference in the UK by an agent of Beijing. The article said that British intelligence issued a notification regarding this Chinese agent working through the United Front Work Department with groups like the China Overseas Friendship Association, group that we used to call the Friendlies. Do you want to say a few words about the United Front Work Department, which also goes back to the early 40s?
Yeah, it does. So I guess it's really important for people to understand that the foreign ministry is one part, a very important part of a much larger system in China, which they refer to as the foreign affairs system, the Xitong in Chinese, and which involves many different bureaucratic bodies, some of which belong to the government, like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Commerce, and some of which are purely Communist Party institutions, like the International Liaison Department, which deals a lot with China's relationships with political parties around the world, especially communist parties, and is very important to China's relationship with North Korea, for example. But also the United Front Work Department, which is again a Communist Party organization, not part of the Chinese government apparatus, and exists to build ties with overseas Chinese groups and also social organizations overseas, and to some extent political parties that might be amenable to doing China's bidding. And that department itself is part of a much broader network of organizations which deal with this theme of quote unquote friendship that we talked about before. And it's really about identifying groups in other countries which might help to blunt the effect of criticisms of China, or potentially change policies in a way that would be advantageous to Beijing and work in line with its interests. And so this case in the UK, which I haven't looked into in a great deal of detail, but related to a Chinese lawyer in London who had very good access to politicians across the spectrum and had donated quite a lot of money to a particular Labour Party MP, and some as well to a Liberal Democrat MP, and MI5, the British internal sort of security organization, I guess. The FBI's kind of counter-intelligence wing would be the closest US kind of corollary to that. They identified this individual as a agent of the Chinese state who was kind of working to further Beijing's interests and shape the environment of British domestic politics. As I said, she kind of had her roots, MI5 says, in this system of kind of parallel diplomacy, which isn't quite diplomacy as we know it, but has this focus on friendship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. I think this United Front work actually originates from the old Soviet Union, and then was brought over to China in the early days. So let's come to the present and talk about the wolf warrior diplomacy that we see today. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what we're seeing now in the world of Chinese diplomacy. What are the strengths and weaknesses as you see it, and where do you think things are likely to go?
Yeah, so I guess maybe we can talk about strengths first, which is kind of hard in some ways when you see Chinese diplomats acting in these like bizarre ways across the world and alienating people. But I think there are some real strengths to the way that the Chinese system works, and kind of two in particular stand out. The first is the ability to deliver messages with extraordinary consistency and clarity. And you'll know this better than me, Ira, as someone who's been on the receiving end of these talking points. But from Chinese trade union organizations to sports organizations, through Chinese diplomats and Chinese companies, which are Chinese state-run companies, the government has this incredible ability to deliver messages on sensitive issues like Taiwan and Tibet with almost sort of word for word consistency. And China and its government organizations have interagency disputes just like every other government in the world, but they are pretty good at papering over them when it comes to negotiating with foreigners. And I think that is a real strength. And you just have to think about the previous administration in the US, where it was pretty easy to identify, the different approaches of, say, Peter Navarro versus Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin on China. That was very visible to the outside world. And, and foreign actors like Beijing could try to exploit those differences as best they could. It's really quite hard to spot that stuff in the Chinese system, and even harder to exploit it as an outside interlocutor. So I think that's a kind of genuine strength. I think the other one is institutional knowledge. China's diplomatic core focuses very much on kind of specialized expertise. So they will send diplomats to one country or one small set of countries throughout a kind of 30-year career. And so diplomats at the end of that process will end up with this ability to say, well, in 1973, you made this promise and you haven't lived up to it, and kind of pinpoint that stuff really quickly. And the US and many other systems don't work in that way. They kind of try to train up generalists, which has its own strengths, of course, but generally that kind of depth of institutional knowledge is not quite as formidable. So I see those as the strengths. And then
if I can just jump in on those 2 points before you get to the weaknesses, I have to say that my own experience fully bears out what you said. I mean, on the first point, it was always striking to me from very early on how consistent the talking points that we would get would be from one person to another, one agency to another, one ministry to another. It was just incredible. And it was even the case from central government to provincial government to local government. And it was always something I was very jealous of, because we were, as you say, I mean, we were very far from that. I mean, if we could get people from our own office to agree publicly on anything, it was already a major victory. And then on the second point as well, I dealt with lots of foreign ministry and Ministry of Commerce people over the years. And as you say, I mean, they would typically, the people that we would deal with would be from the Americas division, as well as people from specialized offices on specialized topics. But those people had years and years and years of experience, particularly the Americas people. They would serve in the embassy in Washington. They would serve in the consulate. They would come back and work on the desk back in Beijing. Then they would go back to the States, and they had far more experience than our counterpart people did. We, particularly the State Department, as you say, I mean, I think they've changed a bit recently, but there was this kind of notion that every young Foreign Service officer was being trained to be Thomas Jefferson, and therefore should serve in every part of the world, every region, and so forth, and not develop the kind of depth of expertise that the Chinese do. So I think both of those points are I agree wholeheartedly.
And I guess when it comes to weaknesses, I mean, there are a bunch, but for me, they kind of all come together as the flip side of that clarity of message that we talked about. This unrelenting ability to just repeat the same talking points, regardless of who is in the room and what they think and how they feel, almost undercuts the entire point of diplomacy. I remember talking to former US ambassador and veteran Chinese diplomat Chaz Freeman, who actually was a translator during the Nixon and Mao talks, about what he thought that it meant to be an effective diplomat. And he said, well, it's this ability to take talking points from your capital and then to bring to bear the kind of cumulative knowledge that you have of the political system, the history, the culture of the place you're working in, the mood of the room on that day, and to finesse those messages and make them appealing to the other side in a way that makes them want to change their policies in a way that matches up with your interests. And there's a real art to being able to do that. It's very, very difficult, but at their best, US diplomats can be really, really very effective at doing that. Chinese diplomats, I think, not so much. Not because of a lack of skill or intelligence or even insight, but just the demands of the Chinese political system and the limitations it places on freedom of action for Chinese diplomats really means that they're not able to practice that art, and in some sense they're deprived of the ability to carry on diplomacy at all by that definition.
Yeah, very, very interesting indeed. So let's take a look. We're not getting too many questions. I'm surprised, but we have a few. So one of our listeners or viewers is asking, where will the competition between the two countries be likely to lead? I assume the two countries meaning US and China. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the right answer to that is. It's a question I actually ask of US and, as far as I can, Chinese officials a lot, because I think there's a lot of talk at the moment about competition and not very much discussion about where this is going. Under the Trump administration, a few officials kind of suggested the end game of this engagement and tussle between the two countries was going to be regime change. I think they were ever in the ascendancy, but there were people who did talk with some clarity about that. I think the obvious kind of counterpoint to that is some kind of coexistence, but that's not a word that sits very easily in Washington. I don't think many US politicians want to use that word about US relationship with China at the moment for fear of being labeled weak. So I suspect really that the default opinion of most US officials is that the two countries will kind of settle into some kind of competitive coexistence, where there are struggles over everything ranging from, international technology to trade and human rights. But there are also some sort of limited areas of cooperation, and there is a kind of way of working together. But I don't really see any sign that we're settling into that kind of rhythm at the moment. I think the two sides are still very, very much trying to feel each other out. I'm here in Australia this week as Secretary Blinken is here for the Quad meetings between the US, India, Australia, and Japan. And if you look at the rhetoric which Beijing uses toward the Quad meetings, it sees it as a clique which kind of aims to keep China down and contain it, and so really the two sides are still in this very, very uncertain period of feeling out each other's intentions and quite a lot of uncertainty, and so I think that's going to continue for some time.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think in the short term, I don't see any prospect for improvement. I think this is a very big year in China, of course, with the Party Congress coming up in the fall, and Xi's plans to solidify his role as party secretary. And in the U.S., the sort of public sentiment is so strongly negative on China right now, and it cuts across both political parties. So I think the Biden administration is very reluctant to put itself out in terms of taking any new initiatives towards China, at least probably for this year at least. They are supposed to put out a strategy soon. It's already been more than a year, but
right.
I'd be surprised if there's any big initiatives in that strategy, given the environment that we are finding ourselves in. So let's see. So now it looks like we are getting a bunch of questions in. In your opinion, when will China reintegrate Taiwan? Reintegrate being in quotes.
Yeah, another great question, and another issue which is very much on the minds of policymakers in Washington. I think the thing is and of course there's been this kind of like build up of war, fear over a Chinese invasion and discussion over how imminent war might be and that kind of stuff. And I think the thing is, if you talk to military experts on the Taiwan question and kind of Pacific military affairs, anyone can tell you how tough it would be for China to land troops on Taiwan and conduct a amphibious landing. Really challenging stuff. And you just have to look back at the history of Gallipoli and the Normandy landings to figure out how tough that has been for countries to do over time, and why it doesn't make any sense for Xi Jinping to do that now. I think the reason that those kind of explanations don't put people at ease is the fact of kind of Xi Jinping's personality and his tolerance for risk, and how little we know about his thoughts and intentions. I did a story a few weeks ago about how the CIA is struggling to kind of penetrate Xi Jinping's inner circle and figure out what exactly he wants on issues, including Taiwan, perhaps even most importantly Taiwan. So that's really a problem, and also just like reading back from his previous behavior. There were a bunch of things which I think the outside world didn't expect Xi to do. Myself included, many people looked at the Chinese political system and said, well, probably Xi Jinping won't abolish term limits because he doesn't need to, because he can just rule from behind the scenes and there's no need to change the party rules. But Xi Jinping decided that he did. He abolished term limits, removed the architecture which had held kind of a semblance of balance in the Chinese political system for a couple of decades, and completely upended expectations and transformed Chinese politics in the process. In 2015, he made a promise to Barack Obama on the South Lawn of the White House that he wouldn't militarize artificial islands that China had built in the South China Sea. And I think most people thought that might be a kind of enduring deal which continued and had some staying power. But within a couple of years, China had indeed militarized the islands and kind of gone in the face of that deal. And so this is a politician with a substantial appetite for risk in a way that we haven't seen for a long, long time, and whose intentions are really difficult to read, even for the Central Intelligence Agency. And so I think that kind of despite that case, which is pretty easy to understand about why it doesn't make sense for China to invade, that's where a lot of the confusion comes from.
Yeah, and it's interesting also for up until a couple of years ago, the Chinese, the PRC government was holding out Hong Kong as a potential model for Taiwan, so-called one country, two systems. But given what we've seen in Hong Kong in the last couple of years, I think the Beijing government has just said, well, enough of that. We're going to do what we need to do in Hong Kong. We're going to crack down, and we'll deal with Taiwan separately. Yeah, it is kind of worrisome, no question. So we have actually we're getting a lot of questions now. We have an interesting one about the Olympics. How do the two Beijing Olympics encapsulate the unified international messaging of China? And I actually wanted to talk a little bit about the Olympics as well. It's kind of interesting to compare this one with the 2008 Summer Olympics. At that time, of course, it was Beijing welcomes you, and everyone was running around trying to learn English and put forward a very welcoming face. And now, of course, we have these diplomatic boycotts, and a Chinese foreign ministry spokesman was quoted as saying, who cares if nobody comes? In a way, you could almost say China's kind of coming full circle. I mean, we talked earlier about how China was isolated in those early years and needed to reach out to foreign countries. Now China is starting to become more isolated again. You could argue maybe by its own choice this time. And it's also interesting to note that the guest of honor, the only really senior level guest at this Olympics was Vladimir Putin. Kind of harkens back to the days when Russia or Soviet Union was China's only friend. So what thoughts do you have on the Olympics and on these matters?
Yeah, so it's a really kind of good point of comparison. We talked earlier about this charm offensive that China launched into in the 1950s, where it was able to kind of target the developing world and build out its influence. The other really impressive period of charm offensive that the Chinese government launched into was in the aftermath of the Tiananmen massacre. And in 1989, and there was this kind of 2-decade charm offensive which culminated in them hosting the 2008 Beijing Summer Olympics. And it's really important to remember in that context that the Olympics were just one part of this much bigger campaign, which in which Chinese diplomats played a role, but even more importantly, I think it went together with a set of policies which gave the outside world cause for optimism about China's trajectory and the kind of country it might become. China had set aside territorial disputes with many countries on its periphery and had done a really impressive job of rebuilding ties with Asian nations. It was going through this process of applying to join and then integrating itself into the World Trade Organization, something which gave foreign companies massive hope about China's future trajectory. And while it didn't explicitly promise political reforms, there were statements by Chinese diplomats which suggested that the human rights situation, the media freedom situation might improve over time. And so that gave the outside world, together with the Olympics and everything that went with it, a sense of where China was headed and why this might be a good thing. And I think now what's really striking is we have another Olympics taking place, but the context in which it's happening is so different. Most foreign businesses are pretty pessimistic about the trajectory of China's economic liberalization. The country's politicians have kind of explicitly disavowed Western-style political reform and have said that that's something that will never happen in China, and are talking instead about an alternate Chinese model. And there are re-education camps in Xinjiang, a massive crackdown in Hong Kong, curtailment of media freedom, the NGO sector, the list goes on and on. And so the Olympics are taking place in this environment where it's very difficult for outsiders or at least outsiders who care about democracy and liberal values to be optimistic about the country's trajectory. And so really it's those contexts which lie behind the games which are kind of most important, I think.
Mm-hmm. So we're almost out of time, but we have several questions on the Belt and Road Initiative. So I don't know if you have any quick thoughts on that. How is Chinese diplomacy and the Belt and Road Initiative related, or how are they related? Will the lack of diplomatic flexibility on the part of Chinese diplomats or Chinese foreign policy be the ultimate undoing of the Belt and Road Initiative? So maybe if you have 2 minutes worth of thoughts on the Belt and Road Initiative, we can conclude with that.
Yeah. So I guess I'll just say one thing about it, which is that for all of the criticism that's leveled at it, kind of justifiably in some cases, this is it's not going to meet environmental standards, or it leads to debt trap diplomacy and all of this kind of stuff, which all has a ring of truth to it and is all really important. I think that the Belt and Road Initiative highlights a couple of things. It highlights the scope of Beijing's ambitions, its ability to kind of look at the international situation and apply the national power at its disposal to shape it and to build influence. And it highlights, we talked about the weaknesses of Chinese diplomacy and that inability to persuade and win over hearts and minds. Well, that's true, but Beijing is really good at opening up its purse strings and using those kind of inducements to win over hearts and minds. And so even as we look out at a world where Chinese diplomats are getting in fights with people and picking quarrels and undermining China's image in many ways, there's another toolkit out there which relates to economic inducement and infrastructure, which really has identified something that is a real need across the developing world and has come up with a solution and put that on offer. And it's a very imperfect solution. It's a very problematic toolkit, but as someone said to me the other day, what is the US's alternate value proposition when it comes to economics? And Donald Trump withdrew from the TPP. It's politically pretty impossible for Joe Biden to rejoin it. There's really no positive vision at the moment, and US officials will say this quite openly for the US when it comes to Asian economics. And so I guess that I would kind of conclude with that thought that the Belt and Road highlights some of China's great strengths, which continue despite all of the problems of wolf warrior diplomacy.
Right. All right. Well, Peter, I can't thank you enough. I think this has been a great discussion. And again, I so there are so many interesting things in your book, and a lot that we couldn't get to today. The role of the last Qing Emperor Puyi, the Sino-Soviet split, and many other things. So people will have to buy the book and read it to get more about that. And also, just the last point, as I said, it's a great kind of a quick and lively and well-written history of modern China. So people can read it for that reason as well. So again, thank you, and thanks to our audience.